I want to thank Rhode and Schwartz for doing this. It's been a very informative day. Also thank our panel of experts that will now be able to take all of your questions that you started with earlier. So joining us today, we have from your right to left, Wim Brouwer. He's CTO of ALU's FirstNet team, Alcatel-Lucent. Then we've got, who you've already met, Jim Harper. He's Director of Business Development at Electrobit. Then we got Michael Schwab. He's Director of Network Testing at P3 Communications. You've already met him as well. Emma Olbrich is co-founder of Signals Research. And then last but not least, we have, Paolo Marini of Prisma Telecom Testing, who you all also have heard from. So I want to get started with just a question that Jim already touched on a little bit, but that I think the rest of the panel can probably expound on. So why has this thing taken so long to get going? You know, I think we had a question from the audience asking the same thing. Wim, do you want to start with that just because you're joining us remotely and we want to get you involved right away?
Sure, absolutely. And I apologize for being remotely. I unfortunately had several conflicts already. But I think there are several different dimensions to that question. First of all, I don't think it is a technical problem, right? Mm-hmm. If you look, LTE has been deployed for a number of years now. So I think what has happened is, first of all, if we look back in 2012, 2013, there was a team within FirstNet who was set up, and I think somewhere in mid to late 2013, there was kind of a reset on both the technical side as well as some of the leadership in FirstNet. But even after that, I think one of the big issues that FirstNet is wrestling with is the bureaucracy, if you want, the governmental implications that are put on them in order to grow, and whether that is hiring people, whether that is having conversations with vendors, for instance, like us. I think all of these dimensions are really slowing down the FirstNet deployments.
Anybody else want to touch that one?
Well, I mean, the spectrum's been allocated for quite a while. I mean, things move slow in the government. This was first identified as a problem in 1995 by John McCain. He put forth legislation saying, hey, we need to set aside spectrum for high definition television, and then said, oh, well, let's dedicate some for PPDR use. Then 9/11 happens, 9/11 Commission comes out with their report, says we need to have a nationwide dedicated network for public safety. Just like Wim said, to his point, the bureaucracy of all that, the first instantiation after the auctions in 2008, spectrum's cleared in 2009, a public-private partnership is created, but it is not funded. That ultimately fails, so almost 4 years goes by with nothing really happening. There were 22 cities and municipalities that wanted to build out, said, hey, we want to build LTE, the technology's out there, Verizon's rolling it out, we want it, no funding made available. 2012 hits, FirstNet gets instantiated, and they've had a lot of problems, a lot of them very public. They have had issues getting money out the door. They've had leadership issues with a loss of their CEO and CTO, essentially. They haven't replaced those in almost a year. So there's a lot of anticipation that was built up over the years, and it still remains to be seen if they can execute on everything that they say they can. So a lot of typical mishaps, I guess you could say, with the federal government, unfortunate ones, for the first responders, though.
Sure. I think Michael touched on this. Do you think anybody will be shot? Is this thing going to be done by 2020? I mean, is everything, all the things you just said, can they get it done by 2020?
Well, this is according to FirstNet. This is their words, and what they've been telling the states is that when their RFP comes out at the end of this year or beginning of 2016, it will be out for some period. It will then have to, and that's just a request for proposal. They then have to agree on the proposal, get into a contract with the federal government for a procurement action. So now you're talking, maybe end of 2016 before that is awarded, potentially. And then you're talking well into 2017, probably before first deployment. So, and then where will those deployments happen? Who gets it first? Where does rural America get it? All those type of things. 2020, I mean, you might see 5G before, FirstNet gets rolled out.
Okay, so all of that said, we've got $7 billion in funding, and then you look at what an AT&T or Verizon spend on their network every year. Is that going to be enough? To what extent will there have to be? It seems to me that there has to be a large percentage of this is going to be roaming agreements. And Jim, you talked a little bit about that. If you want to.
Yeah, I think definitely in the beginning, it's a huge task to build a network, especially from the ground up. And if you consider the fact that like Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and Sprint have very mature networks with backhaul and towers in place, starting from scratch is a daunting task. So certainly, the idea of partnerships and things like that, comes to mind. Yeah. Whether or not that's executed or not remains to be seen. But certainly, it's a big task to start from scratch.
Right. Coming from Wireless Week, my initial question that always comes to mind is what's in it for the carriers. Do any of you have any thoughts? I mean, it's such a a massive bureaucracy and so many moving parts. What's in it for the carriers to get involved in this? Plus, they're going to have to be providing a service that can't go down. It has to be first in line. Any of you have any comments on that?
So it might be there's obviously spectrum in play that's owned and managed by FirstNet. So that's something that's a consideration for the carriers. And then if there is some kind of enterprise revenue or something that comes from this type of providing this type of service. So, but then again, there's things to consider too, like different classes of phones, and whether or not we talked a little bit during my presentation today about extending that into business critical domains and things like that. So, perhaps some plays can be made in that area. It'll be interesting to see.
So, we talked a lot about the number of different moving parts and who needs to be involved here. We've got regulators, we've got device makers, we've got the carriers, we've got the testing market. Who leads the charge here? How does this all come together?
I mean, FirstNet's leading the charge right now, from that aspect.
Right.
There was mention of it. So there's FirstNet has put a lot of emphasis on this RFP that they're putting out. That'll include their potential business plan, how they're going to build the network out, in addition to technical requirements. That's met some hiccups here as of late. This Friday, actually, there's going to be a special meeting by FirstNet to determine the board is going to meet, they're going to have a special vote, and potentially vote on whether to release that or not. And that'll tell the community then how to respond. And right now, it could be, there's conjecture, right? Is it an MVNO model? Is it a managed network by a carrier? Is it a full-on build-out by FirstNet? Is it given to some other entity to go manage? There's some cost-sharing models put out by companies like Rhode and others that are trying to get into the marketplace. So really unknown, which makes it difficult for infrastructure and especially device OEMs to know, because you don't know if you have to do carrier aggregation,
exactly,
bands, and that has to go through the standards process. So there's a lot of things really unknown at this point. And I would say, at least in our talks that we've had from putting my analyst hat on, all the carriers that we have talked to very few have thought of putting their normal mobility users on the network. Almost every single proposal that I have seen has been for M2M traffic. They want to offload Amazon onto the network, iPad users, and then strict M2M type devices onto the network, where delaying that communication perhaps, or giving precedent towards public safety communications would not necessarily be detrimental to the user experience for the users on M2M devices. So that's the way they're trying to parlay it in there, that, okay, we understand there's going to be encumbrances to the commercial network, but it's not a mission critical type task for the commercial network, or it's not going to have a huge revenue impact.
Sure. Jim, did you have something?
No, no.
Okay. So to some it might seem like sort of a given that first responders will just use this network once it's built, but that's not the case. They're not bound by any kind of law that they have to use this. They can go their own way and use one of the commercial networks or their own networks. What's going to be the differentiating factor that's going to say make this the right thing for first responders and they're going to use it?
That's a very good question. Can be better. Sorry? Can be better service, maybe cheaper.
Yeah.
So it has to be at least attractive to the users to make that switch. So first they have to be convinced they need this data service.
Right.
Partially they may already use other commercial carriers, so it must be attractive to actually switch networks.
What has been the sort of opinion of first responders? Have they, after 9/11, was there an outcry, we need this? Is that enough to justify the building of it and essentially that they will use it? I mean, because they do realize there's a need for it.
I haven't been in the US in 2001, but to my knowledge, they had serious problems with all the interoperability to work properly together, and that's the reason why they put money aside to build a network that potentially fulfills all those requirements.
Yeah.
Also, too, I think there's interest, though, in first responders in leveraging broadband capabilities that don't exist today with the systems they have. Being able to share videos, live feeds from scenes, and share large amounts of data and information amongst different entities is really something that is of interest to them. So, using LTE to do that is an excellent solution.
In your talk, you mentioned EMBMS. Can you talk a little bit more about how that might be used or applied?
Yes, basically, sharing information from one to many. Like you could share a video feed, for example, from one source, from like a command center, with multiple people who are in the field or at different scenes. It's a very efficient way to share that type of information in a broadcast or multicast type of mode. So yeah, I think that's one of the key features that we see. We've seen it demonstrated in the commercial domain. I think Verizon did some stuff with it at the Super Bowl in 2014 in New York. And that's something that certainly could be leveraged by the public safety community for information sharing.
Right.
And you talk about EMBMS, so there was a demonstration I saw at Mobile World Congress for mission critical push-to-talk early deployment of that on EMBMS, utilizing existing EMBMS in Release 10. So you think about it, if this room was completely packed every seat and you needed to get out and alert, hey, there's been a chemical spill, chlorine attack, normal LTE, SMS or MMS text messaging, it might take a long time to get alerts out to that many people in a unicast mode, whereas you could get out that information instantaneously to everyone.
Yeah.
One of the biggest alerts, or biggest uses that we've seen is Amber Alerts for public safety. So what they call the golden hour, that first hour, if you can get that information out to the first responders, you have a very, very high chance of recovering the victim. So being able to do that efficiently, if you wanted to get that across multiple states and tens of thousands of users, that's an extremely effective way to do that.
Sure. So there's going to be a network that is going to have to deal with incredibly, huge spikes in traffic, disruptions, all kinds of disaster-related crises. We just saw a case here in the United States where I think a fiber line was cut in northern Arizona, and the entire northern half of the state basically lost all communications. You know, how does this network have to behave, or what kinds of technologies are going to be involved to ensure that it can do what it needs to do? Which, you know, the commercial networks are there, but you know, when the unthinkable does happen, how does this network and what's going to be used to ensure that it can do what it's there for?
Probably there is a specific need for implementing a lot of redundancy on the network in order to support for network outages on some specific backhaul links, so it will complicate a bit the network. Also, another important point is that on this kind of network, we are expecting services that took many years to be implemented on commercial network. If we speak about the voice over LTE, since the inception of the first LTE network, it took something like 4 years to have voice over LTE implemented. Now we want on FirstNet features like voice over LTE from day 0 and from day 1, and also we want eMBMS, which is quite a recent feature in terms of network implementation. This complicate further the implementation.
Wim, it looked like you might have something to offer there.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly it took quite a while to introduce voice over LTE. I think a lot of that had to do, though, with complications in a commercial network, right, where you have lots of other legacy networks, whether they're 3G, UMTS, CDMA, there's any number of other radio technologies that voice over LTE had to interwork with to make it successful in a commercial network. Sort of the good part for FirstNet is they don't have legacy networks. So in some sense, it's actually easier to build their network than a network from a commercial carrier with lots of embedded other technologies. So there's a big advantage. But clearly eMBMS is an important feature that public safety will need, and other than primarily demonstrations, that has had limited use in the commercial space so far. But it's clearly, as I think Emil also said, it's going to be critical to public safety, especially once you start doing mission critical push to talk, and you get lots of first responders in a relatively small area. To be able to do mission critical push to talk to that many people in a small area, you will need the multicast broadcast capabilities, the eMBMS.
True.
And just to add to that, one thing I'll pump Wim's company up, Alcatel-Lucent, that they've been involved in very early on is helping define quality of service metrics. So QoS for, as Paolo mentioned, for VoLTE, very well defined. But for other applications, 3GPP really leaves it open to the service provider to define. So you asked about what features are in LTE. Well, quality of service is really, and what's going to differentiate the public safety network from commercial networks. Now, I'm putting any legislative net neutrality things aside for a minute. Assuming this can be done, then public safety will be able to prioritize their traffic and or users, so they could prioritize specific users, applications, or a derivative thereof, matrix that out, so they can give priority access to those. They have separate access classes for the devices. So right now, the access overload class that's assigned to users is randomized. For public safety, they'll get dedicated ones potentially. So that's another way to differentiate themselves. And then through preemptive access, being able to set that up as far as a quality of service mechanism. So those are really key differentiators with regards to how this network will be utilized by public safety. Now, what those applications are and what they agree upon, that's a bit of a discussion point, but that's probably one of the biggest things I see.
Sure.
Yeah, I got a question.
I fully agree. Those are key capabilities. that they will definitely have an FirstNet network, where it remains to be seen whether in a commercial network they would ever get these kind of capabilities.
Yeah, I get a question to that. I mean, we saw in Michael's presentation that JerseyNet and LA rigs probably use a lot of sell-off wheels with satellite backhaul. Might there not be latency issues? Is that the right way to build a public safety network compared to a commercial network? What's your thoughts on that they're using these cows a lot and then want to have that QS as a differentiator to commercial networks? Is that the right way to build a network, Wim?
Well, so there's a couple dimensions to that, right? First of all, I think, at least for instance in the state of New Jersey, the reason they chose cell on wheels and system on wheels was to be able to quickly deploy a network and learn what it means to deploy cells on wheels and system on wheels. However, if you talk about implementing a permanent infrastructure, which essentially New Jersey is doing, right? They have like 37 cell sites, but they're basically parking them there. So they avoid having to build powers, having to deal with permitting and all those kind of issues that may delay the deployment of a network by using the deployables. But clearly, if you were to try and use those deployables strictly with satellite backhaul, that becomes a pretty limited capability. So in all of these cases where they're using them, they're actually primarily using it with either microwave backhaul or with fiber backhaul in some cases, right? And again, they're really not what I would say key applications of a deployable, right? To me, a deployable is really important if I get some kind of a disaster, right? Take Hurricane Sandy, right? If I lose my infrastructure, that's really where a deployable has a key role to play, right? I can't put a tower back up in a few hours, but I can bring in either a cell on wheels or a system on wheels and provide service rather quickly and to restore at least the immediate first responder communications technologies. And so that, I think, is really the key application of a deployable. And some of the ones that we currently see in both LA rigs and state of New Jersey are really kind of not a prime application for deployables.
In a situation like the Boston Marathon, if you do give prioritization to, say, first responders, and they are, say, on a roaming partnership with the major carriers, how does that affect traffic between? Because there was a lot of coordination between loved ones and trying to find where people were, or is it just that first responders in this case are going to need that, and that's sort of the priority?
I think the reality is, if it's legal, if you can do that, which that's a big question. Mm-hmm. FirstNet is probably going to have to incentivize the carrier. They are going to have to pay for that priority service. It doesn't come for free. I don't know that, in the goodwill of trying to support first responders, all the carriers will say, hey, exactly what you said. We were trying to get in touch with loved ones either through social media or calling them or texting them, and that's why is that less important than public safety person. So I think there would have to be some incentive there for that. Whether that, I don't know that any carrier is going to support that necessarily because of all the issues surrounding that.
Yeah, I mean, there was, I think, for months after the Boston event, there was a debate about how things went. Did they shut down networks? There's the whole security thing and, setting off bombs with cell phones. And so it seems like a big, quite an issue that will have to be dealt with at some point. I want to make sure that we do get to everybody's questions, so I'll open it up now if anybody does have questions about any of the talks that we've heard today, or any issues that we've already talked about.
Do we have questions? There's one.
Yeah, my name is Ashish. I'm from Motorola Solutions. I have a question regarding the administrative part of the sharing the commercial networks for FirstNet, right? So I'm sure there's technology out there that we can use. There's like QoS, and we can do a whole bunch of things to share and even use the same base stations and everything for public safety. But my question is that, like, for example, one of the slides in one of the presentations talked about it being the law for the government to own the equipment. Like, that was one of the bullet points that I saw. I may have even misread it, I don't know. But administratively, if you see the history of mission critical systems like LMR and stuff like that, they've always been owned by the government. So do you see it being a problem, like administratively, like if somebody makes a misconfiguration, now it's not only affecting the commercial user, but the government user as well? So from that perspective, what are your thoughts? Like, do you see any hurdles there in the implementation of FirstNet?
Anyone?
I can't answer for FirstNet, but as far as shared space, you're right. That's never been done necessarily, but I guess I would contest that a little bit. So take, for instance, the Raycal network in Iowa. That's a public-private partnership. You take Marcom in Ohio, another public-private partnership, where the state created an entity that manages the network. It's a separate public or private company that manages LMR networks. So they do that for trunked radio systems now. So there's already precedent in the US for that being set up. Now, what they have for mitigation policies if a problem is made, I'm sure there's liquidated damages and things like that. That's on the federal scale, that's not necessarily happening, except for in the IT space where you have a lot of cloud services. So Google is doing a lot of work with the government right now, so is Microsoft Cloud. And so the government doesn't own those servers anymore, right? They buy a space, it's secured, but if something happens, parameter happens, that's all negotiated in the contract. So there's already been precedent set for that, so I don't necessarily see that as an obstacle to happening. Has it traditionally happened? No, but there are states that are doing that right now that have turned over the reins, essentially, where these commercial companies actually manage the spectrum, so they'll go to the FCC, petition for a license, they go install the infrastructure, they manage the updates, upgrade all the radios, et cetera, and then just like a service provider, they pay a fee to this company to use that push-to-talk radio. So moving that model to FirstNet, that's absolutely something I think that could be, people have put forward those proposals, so not unlikely necessarily.
The other dimension to that is also that LTE is a lot more complicated technology than, for instance, a land mobile radio system, right? So having public safety managed an LTE system and have nationwide, especially if you do that at a regional level, that requires significant expertise. So it's not obvious that that's a path to success necessarily either, as opposed to having somebody who has a lot of experience in managing an LTE network, manage that network for them.
Any other questions?
I'm curious as to your perspective on how much of an issue NIMBYism is going to be for FirstNet. We've already seen LA RICS run into issues in terms of concerns about cell sites being located at public safety firehouses and whatnot, and that actually derailed them for a while. I think they're getting back on track. But I'm curious as to how you see them dealing with that, trying to build a nationwide network, but having to deal with all of these jurisdictions that may or may not be any more welcoming to them building towers as they are to commercial carriers.
Okay, I take that. That will be definitely a big issue, as we've seen in Los Angeles already. The carriers have certainly a lot of knowledge and face comparable problems to address it properly, and it may take time. It may delay projects, may delay rollouts in different markets even, or there's spotty coverage that one or two or many towers are actually missing.
Wim, did you
Yeah, and in fact, I think that's an important other driver for a partnership with a major US carrier, or maybe multiple, right? The expertise, the infrastructure that they can bring to the table, including towers, in backhaul infrastructure, where they know what can be done, they know what's there. It will help alleviate some of these issues that we have seen in LA-RICS, and undoubtedly we would see elsewhere as well.
Kelly, you bring up a good point, though. I think it's really up to how FirstNet interprets their independent authority. If they have to meet all the NIMBY laws, and even if you, so for instance, if that's the case, if they take it to the letter of the law, then even if they go to American Tower or they go to Bechtel or Crown Castle and sites that have been around for 20 years, they still have to go through the entire process of getting it approved federally. That will be very, very difficult to overcome. They're going to have to figure out a way through that. Because to Wim's point, if you go to, it makes sense, go with an existing carrier or existing service provider that has assets already, cell tower provider, you just lease space, it's already been zoned, it's approved, you didn't meet, National Historical Monument requirements, and is it, affecting bird migratory patterns and all these other requirements that the federal government puts on. You have to go through that for every single site.
And none of that changed with the most recent easing of those regulations that the FCC was just talking about. So still a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I got another question. So we got JerseyNet and LA and Harris County in Texas and Adams County in Colorado. So all these sites are disconnected, right? So they're using their own, most likely, infrastructure vendor for system on wheels, cows. They're building core network functionality. So is FirstNet, these guys, not creating problems for the future when we're building a nationwide network with interference issues or connecting the different models together? I mean, that is a huge pain in the butt for the commercial carriers already, right? Making the different infrastructure components work. Isn't these programs out there creating problems for the future to make that all interoperable? What do you think?
Well, partially. Oh, go ahead, Wim.
I'm sorry. So as part of this spectrum lease agreement that each of these municipalities has with FirstNet, there is actually a clause that says that eventually they have to integrate into the FirstNet network. Now, what that exactly will look like and in what form, that is obviously something that needs to get worked out. Possibilities are that maybe some of the core components will migrate to FirstNet core components, or maybe they find a way to make them interwork. But clearly the long-term objective is, and part of the spectrum lease agreement is that ultimately they have to integrate into the overall FirstNet network.
And let's be realistic here, okay? So you're talking Adams County, 16 sites, 34 sites, I think, in New Jersey when it's all said and done, potentially. 20 plus, I think, that are funded. 14, I think 12 that are on the air in Harris County. Remains to be seen if LA will even be able to go forward, even if they are 200 sites. Shutting those sites down and putting in your infrastructure vendor of choice is not unheard of. I mean, that happens all the time in the commercial world where they rip and replace. I've been through that many times. So that you're talking about really, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively small number of sites. So they have to evaluate, is the cost of integrating 4 different infrastructure vendors worth it, of core networks, to make them work, or do we just take eNode B interoperability, test that out, and say, okay, we'll just keep the eNode Bs and tie into whoever's core network. There's a lot of different ways to go about that. To your point, FirstNet is and NTIA. They just awarded New Mexico their BTOP grant, and as part of their BTOP deployment to go to, that's the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program. They're building out Band 14 LTE cell sites in the state of New Mexico, but they will tie into the core network in Colorado. So to test specifically what you're talking about.
All right. Anyone else?
Okay, then I have another question. So we talked about VoLTE, right? And commercial carriers, they develop like RCS, Rich Communication Suite, right? And then you have chipset vendor A, IMS stack vendor B, RCS app vendor C. So is FirstNet going to face the same problems. They should, get it all off one hand. Maybe Electrobit is doing that. So what are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, I think Volta feature is a complicated feature. We've seen, we know from our testing and evaluation of it, it's a heavily parameterizable feature. There can be some uniqueness between carriers, and I know there's been some mentions in the news and the public domain too about even Verizon and AT&T working together to have common sets of parameters. And one of the things was the GSMA IR92 spec that was aimed at, ensuring interoperability on Volta. But again, I think that spec even leaves some openness in terms of fine tuning. So that's something that I think is still out there. It's an issue that needs to be looked at. I mean, within the context of a single carrier, I think it can be locked down. Obviously, 2 major commercial carriers have Volta in selected markets, but that's something that needs to be looked at, I think, as a whole by FirstNet.
Hi, Keith Radowski, CTO with Quintel. In building, DAS, hybrid DAS with cellular bands, public safety bands, that's growing, but not really deployed very well. Also, the notion of the fact that in AT&T and Verizon, the government systems business unit is a completely different silo. Doesn't merge until the CEO level, for example, and there's not a lot of interoperability between the departments within AT&T, within Verizon, and so on. How do you guys see the operators actually gearing up to really pull this off with teaming with FirstNet? And also, any comments on the DAS in building space, how that's going to evolve to serve the end solution?
I don't want to take everyone's time. Well, on the in-building side, that's an interesting question. So when the legislation was first put out, if you go back to the FCC, before even FirstNet was created in the second report and order, the $7 billion, if you read very carefully the language, it was designed for outdoor coverage only, no indoor penetration. That's how they backed into the $7 billion. So if you look at that, you're saying, well, you only have to provide, mobility, outdoor coverage for external antenna in a vehicle. That changes what your network design looks like significantly if you don't have to do first or second wall penetration. Now you talk to the first responders, you're like, yeah, we do walk into buildings occasionally for fires, and they need that, and they realize they need that, and that's part of, you have the Safer Buildings Coalition and other initiatives that require, National Electric Code. Any new buildings over 100,000 square feet have to have, a DAS system in there. That only applies to narrowband communications. It hasn't been adopted for LTE. I think that'll change. The network hasn't been deployed yet, but as they see that necessity, they'll put that in there. It doesn't do anything for existing buildings, so that still remains to be seen how you address that with either DAS or small cell. You have LTE unlicensed, we'll hear about that. A lot of different solutions potentially coming down the pipe. And then you just have the penetration of 700 megahertz. It does provide you some benefits from that aspect. As far as how AT&T and Verizon manage, internally, I don't know that. I do know, they're looking at a value proposition. There's, it's the last chunk of beachfront property at 700. The problem is you have a 600 megahertz auction that's happening very, very soon. And so if they're allowed to bid on that, I think it changes the value proposition for FirstNet.
All right.
I got a question here.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation and discussion. So I wish FirstNet was here to answer some of those questions. Okay. So it seems like, what I gathered from all the discussions, that there is an RFP coming that will first time tell all of us what they're looking for. Do you think in your mind, based on release, 13 is coming later and all kinds of things, do you think in your mind that there is a commercial proposition that could meet all the first responders' needs? Yes, no, or maybe?
Go down the line here.
So, I think, well, so first of all, it depends what you call a commercial proposition, right? If that means, is there a profitable business case for FirstNet to be had to deploy public safety for LTE? I think the answer is absolutely yes, but it has to involve partnerships with some of the major carriers, most likely, or potentially somebody who is interested in the spectrum and is willing to provide a quite substantial amount of money to help fund that initial network. But I think it's certainly doable.
Yeah. I mean, what percentage of this network will be from scratch, would you say? I mean, if you had to put a percentage on it, you know, I mean, at $7 billion, it seems like it could be just a fraction that would be from scratch.
Well, it really depends what you call from scratch, right?
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, all the ENOBs are most likely new, although a commercial carrier could potentially add a band 14 spectrum to an existing ENOB. That's certainly a possibility. But I think clearly you have to leverage tower infrastructure, you have to leverage backhaul infrastructure to be able to make that 7 billion go as far as you can, and leverage all those existing infrastructures, and then a lot of that 7 billion probably has to be used in the rural environments where even commercial carriers may not necessarily have the infrastructure, and help build infrastructure there to have a complete network.
Right. Just to the gentleman's question, if you look at what the FCC put in, as far as the spectrum requirements, and if you look at the law, Public Law 11296, which created FirstNet spectrum allocation, it mandates the use of LTE 3GPP Release 8 as a minimum baseline. So, you know, they made a delineation saying, hey, this for PPDR, for public safety in the U.S., Release 8 at a minimum is going to provide what we need as a baseline to grow from for public safety. So I think, yes, LTE offers in its current instantiation what public safety needs, and it'll grow as their needs grow. As they start utilizing this technology and they want to use, you know, EMBMS and direct mode and all these other features, OEMs will start putting that in, it'll start getting tested, and it'll start getting optimized. You know, you have to start somewhere, right? So if you keep waiting saying, well, Release 13 is going to have this feature, well, Release 14 is going to have mission critical person, you'll never get it deployed.
Okay.
What else?
So I got a final question, if I'm allowed to ask the final question, right?
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Because we're running out of time, and it's a great panel, and I always feel we need more time for this. But maybe a long question, one word answer, right? So the question that we try to answer is LTE, are we ready? Oh, LTE for public safety, are we ready, right? So technically, I think there's only one answer. So the question is bureaucracy the problem? Is the government the problem? Can they build a network like this? Or is the technology the problem? Yes or no?
So from my perspective, clearly government bureaucracy is potentially the problem. I don't see really technical issues.
So government the problem. Paolo, what do you think?
I agree. Technology is here, so it offers a lot of possibility. Probably for a safety network, the goal is to build a safe network, which means a lot of resilience, a lot of redundancy. So the goal is not to build a network which can be operated with low cost or with high efficiency. The goal is to build a network that is safe, is mission critical. Technology is here, so by design we can achieve those goals. Then from the administrative point of view, it's another story.
Email working on both sides of the ocean?
You know, government doesn't, you know, coming from that sector, I'm no longer there, as you know, but it currently is a problem, but it doesn't have to be, okay? Take a look at what's, you know, UAE, they dedicated 7 megahertz, 7 by 7 megahertz allocation for PPDR and military use. They also dedicated 5 megahertz for direct mode allocation, and then fully funded building that network. They did the same thing in Jordan. Same thing, you know, UK is putting forth an effort, you know, trying to do, you know, through their lot assignment. In Belgium, they went an MVNO model. So you can go to Blue Astrid, go get an MVNO phone designed for public safety. So government doesn't necessarily have to be the problem. Hasn't been and technology is definitely not the problem. That's not an issue. I would say this on the technology side. Requirements need to be put in place, because if you don't know what your requirements are with regards to having to implement EMBMS, direct mode, what carriers you're going to have to aggregate with, there's a lot of, they could want that technology now. Things could get deployed early on, and there could be issues, with regards to interoperability. Right now, there's no compliance or conformance test specifications for devices. So all these phones that are going out, none of them are having to meet any requirements. There's no requirements for the base stations. There's no acceptance criteria for base stations going on the air or for core networks. So it's really literally the Wild West right now in the US with regards to, testing. So, my answer is a little long, but government doesn't necessarily have to be the problem. It has been in the US though. Mike,
Working in Germany with the government, what do you think?
You can always start doing something and ask for forgiveness afterwards. So maybe it's just doing some bold decisions that are missing currently. Fine-tuning this RFQ for a long period now, and it might be better to release and adjust afterwards.
Jim, you have the final word.
I guess I would say about the technology, I have a phone in my bag that supports LTE band 14. So the technology is definitely not a hindrance to this process.
And it's tested with the best equipment that's available on this planet, right?
So very true.
Everything.
Yes. Hey, thank you very much for the panel. So great applause, please.